Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. So welcome back to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. I am so excited about today's episode because I'm welcoming back a very special guest, someone I've had the honor and privilege of speaking with before and whose work I recommend more than any other to my clients, Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. Mary Frances is the author of The Grieving Brain, a groundbreaking book that has helped so many people understand what's happening in their minds and hearts after a loss. If you haven't listened to our first conversation, I highly recommend you go back and check out episode 69. It's a sort of a foundational conversation that sets the stage for today's topic. Because today we're diving into something new. Mary Frances' latest research and book, The Grieving Body, is where we explore how grief is not only something that we think and feel emotionally, but also something that we experience physically. Something that lives in our body and affects it in ways that we can often not realize. It's a fascinating and deeply validating conversation that I can't wait to share with you. So a little bit more about this week's guest. Mary Frances O'Connor has a PhD and is a professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Grief, Loss and Social Stress Lab, investigating the effects of grief on the brain and the body. Her book, The Grieving Brain, was included on Oprah's list of best books to comfort a grieving friend. O'Connor holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Arizona and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in psychoneuroimmunology at the UCLA Samuel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. Having grown up in Montana, she now lives in Tucson, Arizona. So welcome back, Mary Frances. It's so nice, and I've been so looking forward. I probably can't help smile because I've been so looking forward to speaking with you again.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation, Natalie. Thank you for having me.
So I have been already a fan of The Grieving Brain. So now we have The Grieving Body. And as I'm working with clients and have experienced it myself, I often speak about the mental aspects or reactional responses for grief, then the physical, the psychological, the mental, the spiritual. And so in your two books, you speak about the brain and now about the body. Why don't you let us in? What is the latest scientific research and what you have found that has now found its way into this new book of yours?
I think that most people are really surprised at how physical grief feels for them. As a scientist, I really go back to what do we know from looking at patterns in people's experiences. And what is very clear from the data from very large studies is that we really can die of a broken heart. And so we know that, for example, a study shows you're 21 times more likely to have a heart attack on the day that a loved one dies than any other day of your life. 21 times more likely. Isn't that a crazy?
That's a lot.
Crazy? I know. It's insane. And it drops off, the next day it is lower and lower and lower each day, but it still remains high at 3 months. A man is still twice as likely to die of a heart attack compared to a married man during that same time. And so those really clear pieces of evidence show us that grief is having a physical effect. Now, of course, we have to keep in mind the body, much like the human spirit, is quite resilient. And although those are high risk numbers, they reflect very few absolute people, right? So the important thing to know is that it is normal for our body to physically respond in grieving, and that for the most part we are able to absorb that blow after our loved one dies. So we'll get more into it, but I think that's where
Mm.
many of us started when we became interested in the physical grieving response.
Yeah. And thinking back as you spoke, in terms of my loss, my first significant loss that I speak about, the loss of my daughter, subsequently I had physical reactions. For example, one that I spoke of often is like I couldn't breathe anymore. I was, for example,
Yes.
feeding my surviving twin, and then something was like I was experiencing below the breast, sort of
Yeah.
in the lungs, and I, it felt like a broken heart, and it
Yeah.
was probably the ribs being out or whatever it was. But
Yeah.
in that state, I was like, what's happening in my body? And the question is always, is that related to grief or not? And so I think many people have this question, well, what of my physical ailments or symptoms or things that I have are related to grief and which are not?
It's such an important question. And the reality is that while I can look at patterns in the data, of course, each person has their own individual experience. So I can tell you things on average,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't mean that it's going to apply to each and every individual. So I would say it this way. I think on the one hand, it's good to be aware, over 80%, study shows, over 80% of bereaved people experience physical sensations in their chest,
Wow.
right? So that means it is normal,
Mm-hmm.
it is
Mm-hmm.
typical for people
Yeah.
to have those experiences. At the same time, because we know of the medical risk, it's also important to take them seriously.
Yeah.
Right. So both can be true at the same time. The idea here is we don't know exactly which symptoms come from which experiences. Is it grief? Is it stress? Is it something else? What we do know is that we can learn to try and soothe and relax the body as much as possible. We can pay attention to what our physical body is telling us. And we can consult doctors, emergency departments, whatever is needed in the moment, if we are having physical symptoms that might overwhelm the body's ability to regulate, right?
Exactly.
So if you're having acute chest pains, you should be going to the emergency department regardless of whether you're bereaved or not. And so I think thinking about it in terms of our body is this elastic, resilient, it can have pain during a wave of grief, and then it should also recede. It should also go back to its normal state. And if it doesn't, we do need to be consulting with medical professionals to make sure that it is just our body readjusting in this new world and not that something has broken.
Mm. I mean, you explained that wonderfully in the grieving brain, what is happening on a mental level, and to understand for many people who maybe come into this loss experience or traumatic loss for the first time, and then they experience that and they don't know how to make sense of it, how to understand what's happening physically, emotionally, and mentally. So explain that. And for specifically people or my clients that I found that really wanted to understand it, it was really helpful for them to get an understanding. Okay, this is what's happening in the brain. This is quite normal. Now, me as a somatic practitioner and in love with somatic work, I'm always teaching the clients about the somatic system, the nervous system, and how it automatically goes, as you said, into resilience, into going back. Why don't you talk a little bit more about the nervous system from your research point of view, the possibility of the nervous system to regulate, and when people know that their nervous system needs maybe support?
Yeah. The output of the nervous system, right? There aren't that many options. Your heart rate can go up or it can go down, right? So your blood pressure can go up or it can go down. And so, it isn't necessarily that the end point is where we can make a difference, but rather, as you say, how do we think about supporting our nervous system? How do we think
Mhm.
about supporting the body as we go through this difficult experience? And so I think of it this way. This might be helpful in terms of the why, because you have to ask yourself, or I ask myself, why does the body react? What on earth? How does this happen? And so I think about it this way, you can't really talk about grief without talking about love and bonding, right? We can't know what we've lost until we talk about what we had. And so if I think about it that way, then when you bond, when you fall in love with your baby or you fall in love with the person who becomes your spouse or whoever it is, you form a dynamic system. We think of our body as ending at the edge of our skin, but really the two of us form this we. And if I say, think about going home right now and getting a hug from your partner, for example, in that moment when you do that, your heart rate goes down a little, your
Mhm.
blood pressure goes down a little, right? Because you are in a system with them. And just bringing them to mind actually affects our nervous system. So, what we have then is that we form an external pacemaker for our loved
Mhm.
ones,
Yeah.
right? Our cardiovascular system includes this other person. Now, when a loved one then is amputated, from our we, the cardiovascular system has to figure out, how do I regulate without this external pacemaker?
Mm.
So just the process itself of learning to regulate, learning to be in this new world where you're not getting a hug when you get home, means that there's going to be physiological changes as your body figures out how to come into regulation again. And that is all pretty typical and pretty normal. But there are times, if we don't find ways to soothe ourselves, that blood pressure can get higher and higher, that heart rate can get higher and higher, right? And so we want to be aware of the things we can do to help with this process of learning to regulate in the absence of our loved one.
Mm. And so for people to get a little bit of a extended history of attachment and
Yeah.
co-regulation. I mean, co-regulation is learned from an early
Yeah.
onset as a baby through the mother. And
Yeah.
so depending on the situation that people have had in their early upbringing, whether there's been enough contact, attunement, or allowing person to embody themselves and being safe with or without, as childhood obviously as the child grows up, that can give an sort of a beginning of the problem of, well, if you find someone else that you can co-regulate with and this person is no longer there or has left or died, then the question is, well, what has been going on in the past about attunement and contact? How was that set up? And so I think especially these people and what you said is an important thing to understand. What was actually the setup of the co-regulation and how is your body able to co-regulate with another person, and if that person isn't here.
That's right. And I think the way to think about that is there are many ways then to learn to regulate again, right? So it's not one size fits all, because we come into a relationship with a particular learning history, with a particular childhood, with a particular body that has ways of
Yeah.
doing things. And as we try to learn how to regulate in the absence of this loved one, we can do things like reaching out to other loved ones who will give us comfort and support. But we can also learn to regulate ourselves, right? To rely on our own capacity through breathing and other practices to sort of help calm and soothe our own body. And we can even transform our relationship with the person who's died, not because we will get a hug from them on this earthly plane again, but we can begin to understand how to interact with them in our own mind that has a soothing impact on our body. Many people have conversations with their loved ones, or they imagine themselves being held by their loved ones. This is actually pretty typical. You're not crazy if you do this. And many of us find that internal relationship, those transformed continuing bonds, to be very, very soothing in the long term. It takes time to get there.
Mm. So what you said made me think about, every child who's learned to co-regulate or who's learned to regulate through co-regulation with their mom, in many cases, or in the ideal case, would learn how to self-regulate, not just through the dummy, not just through the thumb, but in other ways. There could
Yeah.
be soft toys or anything else.
Yeah.
Like if you look at your child, you can see them regulate themselves, even if it is thumping on their pillow or something like that.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be calm meditating.
Right.
But then we learn to self-regulate. And obviously, if we have someone dear that has died, we have, in many cases, a close bond. And that regulation, that co-regulation through another being is no longer there. Now, one of the things is, I think, there's different ways, as you were said, about regulation. And I think it's important for people to hear that it's not just a person, it can be the person. And the autonomic nervous system it always makes a balance between cues of safety and cues of danger. And if, for example, what you, Mary Frances, suggested as imagining your loved one, if that is more of a cue of danger for the autonomic nervous system, as opposed to, oh my God, maybe it's post-traumatic stress of the
Yeah.
images that happened, then maybe there's another way to regulate. But if,
That's right.
however, that memory or that remembrance of the person hugging you is a cue of safety, then go with that. In my case, for example, I dream about my mother regularly, and it's 13
Yeah.
plus years later after
Yeah.
her death. And I think now when I remember a dream, in every case, I know it's a dream when I dream.
Yeah.
And I'm absolutely thrilled that I get to see her and meet her.
Yes. Yes,
And
of
I have these
course.
conversations with her, and I'm like, yeah, I know she's not alive because I know I'm dreaming, but this is the place that I have
Yes.
with
But
her.
you make an excellent point, which is we have to figure out what works for us. And we have to figure out what works for us when. So the strategy that we might use as we get into bed at night might be a very different strategy than what we use as we're walking into a work meeting.
Right.
It's important to have a whole toolkit of coping tools, of coping strategies. So, if you're headed into a meeting, it may be, you know what, I'm going to take 5 deep, slow breaths. I am going to pretend this isn't happening. I'm going to use every avoidance strategy, that I can because I have to get through this next meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. But if it's the only tool in your toolkit to keep avoiding thinking about it, to keep avoiding the fact that waves of grief overcome you, then that's probably not a good long-term strategy, right? If you only have a hammer, it's very difficult to fix a mirror,
Yeah.
right? And so we have to have these other strategies as well. We have to find other living loved ones we can co-regulate with. We have to find the way that it makes sense for us to engage internally with the person, or look at photo albums or whatever it is. Or, as you said, there are many ways to self-regulate. Many people go for a run. The way
Yeah.
they feel at the end of a run is actually what helps them to feel calm and soothed. They need that output of energy in order to get into a better body state.
Mm. Yeah. So if people like running as an example, that's sort of a sympathetic arousal, and
Yeah.
the energy is being expelled or used as a way to
Yeah.
then do something with the energy is there. So
Yeah.
there's fear of or fight or flight based sort of energy, the sympathetic. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, and I mean, the language that you use in the grieving body as well as the grieving brain really speaks to me in the way that I speak to my clients. So as one of the key messages, it's like, and what I always say, we don't get over someone or something at a loss, but we integrate.
Yeah.
And so tell us a little bit how you found that the body plays this role in the integration.
Mm. Here I can speak from personal experience, I think, because in many ways, while I, spend a lot of time in my lab and doing research studies, part of communicating why that data is useful is by allowing readers to see what does it mean to have a life? How does it look different if you know the data?
Mm-hmm.
And so even though it's only my experience, after my after my mother died when I was 26, I went on to be diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And while it is clear my mother's death did not cause my multiple sclerosis, I have many risk factors. It runs in my family, and I grew up in the northern hemisphere where you get less vitamin D, blah blah blah. Um, Nonetheless, it was during the stress of coping with her loss that those symptoms, those MS symptoms emerged. And what I had to learn over many decades then, doesn't happen overnight, was that there was no room in my day-to-day awareness for what my physical body was doing. You described, for example, not feeling like you could breathe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, it was that I had these physical sensations that were caused by the neuropathy, but I I either had just an alarm signal when I felt those, or I ignored them completely. And
Mm-hmm.
neither of those were very helpful responses. So over time, learning to sit and listen to your body, to not be afraid of what your body is trying to tell you, whether that's needing a good cry or my body is all tense and tight and I need to find a way to relax my muscles, whatever it is that your body is telling you. And then to try things, try out one of your coping toolkit
Absolutely. Yeah.
and see what happens, because it may not be the right thing for you, but then you'll try something else, or you'll try it at a different time of day or in a different season, and it will work differently.
Yeah. When you said that of speaking about when your mother died, I also now just realized that when my mother died, I had different physical experiences. Obviously, I also didn't just give birth, but
Right.
in my mother's case, it was 4.5 months later. So I still had a toddler, but I
Yeah.
felt a lot of I would classify it anger, but there were different ways. It's not just
Yes.
anger. Anger is a simple word for it. But what
Right.
it made me do, in retrospect, it's good to see. I went to walk in the creek behind our
Yeah.
house, and
Yeah.
it's a little creek and it has a river. And I would walk up and then walk down, and I would imagine that the water was running through me and just taking out
Mm.
all that um,
Mm.
yeah, I want to call it anger, but it's frustration or whatever,
Yes.
that tension that
Protest.
I had. Protest,
Yeah.
exactly. That's a good
Yes.
word.
Yes.
Protest, of course. I've never thought about protest. Of course, I was
Yes.
angry with my mother because she died of suicide, and
Yeah.
uh, there was a lot of anger. Protest is a good word.
Yes.
So I went walking. So I gave my body um, some form of expelling that energy, of doing something
Yeah.
with that protest.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it's good to see what I needed or what happened when I had my daughters and one died is different to what I did just 5 months later.
You
Yeah.
know, one of the patterns that we see, and this even comes from John Bowlby, who started us down this path of understanding attachment, but it comes from animal researchers and grief researchers. When we have a loss, when something so important is taken away, we have two common responses, and they are protest and despair. And
Mm.
I describe protest as that, wait, what? They're gone. And you feel, if you're in a store and you look down and your toddler isn't next to you, right? That energized protest, this can't be happening. This isn't
Yeah.
this isn't right. And then the other response that we have is despair, which is, oh no, they're gone. And you feel how different that is in the body, the gravity of that, the withdrawal of that. And what's so interesting is the information is the same in both cases. In
Meaning?
both cases, we are adjusting to the loss. We are saying, oh no, they're gone. But in one case with protest and in the other case with despair,
Mm.
right? But it's all, grieving is a form of learning. We're learning, wait, they're gone. And what does this mean for my life? And how am I going to live? And how can this be true? And so I think it's helpful to think about how your body is responding two very different ways in the same grieving experience of trying to understand with that energized protest and that withdrawn despair. But importantly, well, two things I would say, just so people aren't confused. It's not that all of protest happens and then all of despair happens and then you're over. It's not a stage model. Many grieving people talk about they wake up in the morning, they look next to them and they have a wave of protest. Wait, where's my spouse? And then despair. Oh, they're gone. How will I even get out of bed? Right. And this happens over and over again because learning is a process of repeating, right? So protest and despair is not a stage model, but two common responses we have. And despair is not the end of the story either in learning, because despair leaves out hope. Despair says, they're gone and I will feel this way forever. But of course, we know, as true as that feels, sitting next to the grieving person, we know that they won't feel this way forever. And so we can lend them our hope. We can support their experience of despair. There's nothing wrong with them feeling despair. And also we can say, I don't know what your life is going to look like. You don't know what your life is going to look like, but I will be here with you until we figure it out, until you integrate this experience into your life and restore a meaningful life that includes this loss.
So if I'm going to put nervous system language to what you were saying, it's beautiful because if for those people who haven't heard, maybe you want to go back to me explaining the basics of the nervous system, but I'll just give it a short summary. If we're thinking about the ventral space, which is the regulated space, and then it's the sympathetic, the aroused stage, which you most often hear about fight or flight, and then there's the dorsal space where you're into rest and digest if it's regulated, but also in a sort of collapse state. So if you're looking at the description of protest, that is sort of a sympathetically aroused space or a response from the nervous system. And when people go into despair, that's more of the flavor of dorsal, sort of the collapse. And it is natural for the nervous system autonomically during the day to cycle through those stages hundreds of times. So as you were just describing beautifully, in the morning you wake up and with shock you realize your husband or your spouse or your is not there. And the first response from having slept is protest, and then is despair. It's just the way that the nervous system regulated to sympathetic and then to dorsal. And what we know is the nervous system wants to regulate back into ventral. It does that all the time. It knows how to do it. But if you think about then, for example, someone say, well, just think about the good times you had when you're in a dorsal collapse state. It might be misguided because it is not possible to think about something that would be a ventral story when you're in a collapse state. So as you just beautifully said, I will be here with you and will pivot slowly for and help the regulation, help the nervous system regulate and integrate so that we can flow back till the next trigger, till the next shock, till the next protest, till the next despair moment. So some of the things you mentioned in the book, which really interest me because of the clients that I'm thinking of, they might be people in sort of middle age, and they have maybe also questions about, are these hormones, or are these, as you were saying, is this just an immune system response to my life, to my age, or how does that play with grief? Maybe could you say a little bit more about the immune system and how cortisol and oxytocin plays a role in grief?
Such an important question. Our bodies are an amalgamation of all sorts of processes that are going on. And so our bodies are an amalgamation of what age we are, where we are in a monthly cycle,
Mm,
whether we've recently given birth, whether we have an injury from working out, or we've had surgery, or our body is in a different state, and that is integrated also with what's happening in our social world. So whether we have people around us who give us lots of hugs and comfort, many of us discovered during the pandemic that our body feels very different when we can't hug anyone, you know?
mm, absolutely.
And so our body is also an amalgamation of our social and emotional world. And what's important is I don't actually think there's a way to say, oh, this little piece here sectioned off, this is grief. And this little piece sectioned off over here, well, that's, because I have rheumatoid arthritis. And then this little piece sectioned off over here is because I'm 51, right? So I think our bodies are much more just integrating all of that information all of
Hmm.
the time. And what it means is, I mean, it's a complex thing to be a human being, right?
Hmm.
And so I think this is something I came to discover with multiple sclerosis. On the one hand, I think we try to optimize our functioning as much as we can. I think we try to look for the coping strategies that work for us, that we can work with the body. So whether that's getting up at the same time every day because that helps to reset our circadian rhythms, or whether that means making sure we get movement in the day because that helps with our cortisol and inflammatory markers, right? Getting movement, moving our body helps our systems to work more effectively. And so, on the one hand, I think there is working with the body and learning as much as we can about what it means for our individual body to work
Hmm.
with it, and simultaneously to know that bereavement is a unique moment in your life. And this is a new normal for a while. And so the acceptance that your memory may not work so well just now, or you may feel withdrawal. You may not feel like going out and doing things with people, even people you love, right? Accepting that this is the new normal and also trying new things is means that we have to really learn how to live very authentically, to really pay attention to what's working, to try new things even when they're uncomfortable and difficult, and to just overall give ourselves a little self-compassion that our body and our mind, our spirits and our relationships are going through an enormous upheaval. And we are going to find ourselves very different for a while and probably forever, but not different in the way that we are right now.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to hear, that word new, or that term new normal for me at the beginning was quite off-putting because I felt like nothing like normal. So to call it a
Yeah.
new normal, I said, thank you, no. Thank you,
Fair.
but no.
Yeah, fair. That
And
that word may seem off-putting.
yeah, and it is also a phase, that doesn't need to be for a forever phase. And I
Yeah.
liked when you said try out new things, even if they're challenging.
Yeah.
And it's the question is also how we assign meaning to the things that we experience. In my case, for example, I'm dealing with chronic pain,
Yeah.
and but I'm or even just with the term bereaved mother or semi-orphan daughter, whatever, I always look at in the moment to say, well, how do I identify? How do I
Yeah.
is that my identification in this moment? Is that because of grief or not?
Yeah.
And I think each person has their choice over what they do.
Mhm.
And still, one of the questions that I have personally in terms of the chronic pain, but also one of the things that people express to me on a regular basis is the sense of feeling exhausted by life, feeling
Yeah.
fatigued, or as you were saying, not remembering things as they used to. Yeah, that could also be age. But what have you found in terms of those topics with the relation of your research with grief and trauma?
I think it is partly that it is just a false dichotomy, whether it is grief or not. It
Mm-hmm.
is grief at this age, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is grief for a person who has chronic pain. It is grief for, whatever you come into grief with, it is all wrapped up together. There is no dividing it out. And so it means that we live as much as we can in this moment, whatever that looks like, while also trying to figure out what the next moment could look like. I I want to say something just ever so briefly because I think, these conversations are so important in part because you and I feel very comfortable with grieving. And so it's good
Absolutely.
to sort of model something. So I used this term a few moments ago, the new normal. Now, I will tell you, I have talked to, gosh, hundreds of grieving people at this point, and I say the wrong thing all the time, right? And the reason that that is true, I am not hopelessly inept, I mostly, is that words mean different things to different people. Words are limited. And so the most important thing is to notice that the person you're speaking with, that the word didn't fit with them, that the word didn't sit well with them, right? And to say, the new normal meant something specific to you, Natalie. Tell me what it is, what do you feel when I say that? Because I don't want to alienate you. I don't want you to feel isolated by, oh, here's a person who doesn't understand me. I want to open that conversation. That word means something to you, it means something to me, but by understanding the difference, I can learn to know you better and support you better in whatever your experience is, right? So I just thought it was a lovely
Mm,
moment in a funny sort of way to be able to say it's okay that we use language that doesn't fit for the other person,
mm.
as long as we're kind of attuned to then allowing it to open conversation rather than shut it down.
Yeah, that's a good point you're making. And it's also a question of timing. Like I
It
had a
is.
similar experience when I asked people about how they felt when people said, I'm sorry for your loss.
Yeah.
And the amount of people I asked, the amount of answers, the diversity of these answers was exactly the same way as the amount of people I asked. And
Yes.
but it also has to do with the timing. And I think
Yes.
coming back to the nervous system, if someone is in an activation, a sympathetic activation, and
Yes.
they are in a protest,
Yes.
they will feel opposed to anything that is going into the direction of accepting or integrating the loss. It's just not the time
It's
because
not the
there is
time.
protest.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean there's something wrong with the intention that was brought out. And it also doesn't mean that the word was right. I'll
Exactly.
give you a silly, not silly, actually very touching, I think, example. I teach a psychology of death and loss class to undergraduates, and they have often learned, even at their young age, they've supported people who were grieving. So a
Mm,
student of mine told me that she and her boyfriend lived next door to an older couple, and they realized at some point that the man had died. And so at Christmas time, my student's boyfriend went over and knocked on the widow's door and said, "Hey, your husband used to put up Christmas lights on your house at Christmas time. Would you like me to do that for you this year?" And she said, "No," and slammed the door. And he went away and came back, into to my student and said, "Oh, I've done just exactly the wrong thing. I'm so embarrassed. I've really hurt her. And how could I be so insensitive?" And then 24 hours later, she came over and knocked on the door and said, "I'm so sorry. I just can't believe that he can't do this. I just can't believe it. And of course, I would love to have you come over and I'll tell you the stories of how he did it and why. And
Yeah.
it wasn't that he had done something wrong. It was just she was in that moment where nothing was going to feel right.
Hmm.
And at the same time, she rather quickly, in this case, could appreciate the intention behind what he
Hmm.
was doing
Hmm.
and found a way to reach out despite feeling this protest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a beautiful story. And some people might stay in protest for quite a while.
Yes,
I mean,
that's right.
that's where we meet people with chronic grief or
Yeah,
post-traumatic stress because
that's right.
the energy is there, not yet fully experienced or expressed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of us, in our culture, many of us are terrified of feeling despair.
Hmm.
Despair, the recognition that the loss is permanent, the loss is final. That recognition is what solves protest. It means we stop searching, we stop yelling and reaching out. But many of us, the minute we start to feel despair, we can't bear it. And we go back to feeling protest. And I think it is a strange thing in our society to say it's okay to support a person staying in despair, not in a way that would lead them to harm themselves. Of course, I do not mean that. But I mean that the wave of despair, which is a part of learning the reality of the loss. That moment of despair has something to teach us as well. Does that
Mm,
make sense, Natalie?
absolutely. I when you speak, I always have clients in mind that I've spoken to, and I often hear for those who have then found me, they said, I've been in the medical system or where people want to move me along to get better. And I have found that that's not always the best, or in many cases, in most cases, I would even dare to say it's not the best course of action because that's
Yeah.
disregarding the person's place and why they are in that place. Let's say
Yeah.
despair. That's a that's a place worthy of the experience of the loss.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Of course you feel despair. Your loved one is not coming back.
Mm.
That is a tragic reality that you're living with. It is also, I think, helpful to remember that often these feelings come in waves. To be afraid of the wave is not to recognize that it rises and it resolves.
So people will obviously, hopefully, be interested in as much as I have. I mean, I've taken so much from your books, and they can find it as always in the show notes. Mary Frances is beautiful with words, so I can highly recommend. But if there was one thing that you hope those who just listened or those who then go away and read your book, would they could take away from our conversation and or from reading The Grieving Body that could change how they view their grieving experience, what would you hope they would take away?
Well, this may sound like a funny analogy, Natalie, but I think there's a way that pregnancy and bereavement are similar. And it is this, grief is not a disease. pregnancy is also not a disease, but no one would doubt that it is a physiological experience.
Yeah.
And that it is a time of increased medical risk. And so we have set up whole systems of care to educate pregnant people about what to expect and the physical, bizarre changes that happen, right? So that they feel comfortable knowing that this is unpleasant, but it's okay. But also to provide surveillance so that we can see, have they actually got gestational diabetes or hypertension? And we do need to intervene when they get outside the bounds of the typical physiological experience. And I think to myself, we could do this with bereavement. We could provide the kind of care that helps people to see, oh, this difficulty breathing or this inability to fall asleep, these are typical changes. And also, if it is still true in 2 months, please come back and see me again, because we do expect that they will improve over time as you integrate this loss.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what part of my work is. Educating people on what is normal given the circumstances of where they're at. So I'm so grateful to you, Mary Frances, for educating those people who are avid readers or who want to listen to your books. I'm very grateful for you putting out all that you have found through your studies. Thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for bringing this conversation to people.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep reading. I promise it will get easier.